Okay. Welcome to Yin. So today we'll start seated. You can always prop the hips up on a blanket, a bolster, or a block. If you have a block, have one nearby, just out in front of you, or maybe have both nearby. I'm not sure if you'll want one or two. You're coming to a cross-legged seat. So shift side to side first so you feel even on the sit bones, and then you can start to play with the legs. So you want to bring the feet out and cross at mid shin as best you can. The feet aren't going toward the hips. Think about them being underneath the knees. So that's farther forward. The shins are parallel. And you want kind of a tight situation with the legs. Maybe the knees are in line with the hips, or maybe they're a little bit wider. That's fine, but you're trying to get them more in line with the hips. So sit up tall, take a deep inhale in through the nose, back out through the mouth. This time, deep inhale in through the nose, back out through the nose. One more of those. Deep inhale in through the nose. And slow as you can, back out through the nose. Keep going on your own. Blink open the eyes. Reach the arms forward, palms facing up. Bring the right arm on top of the left arm. Find eagle arms. So maybe you just grab the tops of the shoulders. Maybe you bring the backs of the forearms together, or maybe you hook the left hand inside of the right hand. Then lift the chest up, but keep the elbows in line with the shoulders, hands away from the face. Core hugs in a little bit, just start to hinge forward. So you're folding over the legs. Now we're putting more weight on the hip opening. Here's where your blocks might come into play. You can rest the elbows, the forearms, the hands on the blocks, but you might need to stack them in a way that feels like it's the right spot for support. You can close the eyes once you get there, but you want to feel like the chest is still reaching forward so you get that shoulder opening. Just a reminder that these are longer holds, so you want to make sure that you're somewhat comfortable. It's always worth it to make adjustments until you are. You'll draw the shoulders away from the ears so that the sides of the neck have plenty of length. Try to stay with your breath, the one we started with. And hugging in of the core a little bit, just so you can easily come back up to where we started. See if you can keep the arms and then release the arms down by the sides. Let the arms just dangle by the sides. The hands will probably touch the floor. Start to take some shoulder rolls, just finding some movement in the shoulders, maybe feeling what you did on one side, knowing that you'll even it out. Switch the direction of the circles with the shoulders, go the other way. Then look at the legs. Notice which shin is in front. Bring the hands back behind you. Separate the feet wide. Let's take windshield wipers. That was a big pose to start our yin practice, getting deep into the hips and the shoulders right out of the gate. So we'll add some dynamic movement as a counter before we switch sides. So you'll come back to seated, other shin in front. Then once you sit up, shift side to side a couple of times. Once you have the sit bones underneath you, which might mean lifting the hips up and then setting them back down again. That also works. Start to bring the shins, crossing the shins at mid shin, about toes pointing straight forward, feet are forward, and then reach the arms forward, palms facing up. Bring the left arm on top of the right. Find eagle arms on this side, hands away from the face so they're not coming in toward the head. And then start to reach forward with the heart, reach forward with the forearms, and find a place on this side where you can rest into the shape, falling deeper and deeper over time. So give yourself that space. And take one more inhale in through the nose. Slowly back out through the nose. Hugging the core for support. Come back up to seated. Maybe you keep those eagle arms and then release them down by the sides. Arms just dangle. Just use the shoulders to find those shoulder rolls. See how different it feels this time now that you've done both sides with eagle arms. And go the other way. Bring the hands back behind you, lean back, separate the feet down, bring the knees side to side, find your windshield wipers, get some movement back in the body. Still slow. We want to calm the nervous system. And you'll come back to seated, but this time we'll make our way to hands and knees. So if you're using blocks, just set them off toward the top of the mat. You may use them for this next shape. Once you come to hands and knees, grab a bolster or stacked blankets if you have them. And you can definitely do these next two shapes without a bolster if you want. But if you have one, grab one. It makes it a little bit, it just changes it a little bit differently. So hands in front of the bolster, knees behind the bolster. If you have blocks, take the blocks up to the tallest height underneath the hands, lifting up the chest. Just a nice way to transition. And then widen the blocks, still on the mat. Step the right foot forward up between the blocks and the hands. So your back knee is down on the mat. If you have a bolster, it's all the way up against that left thigh. So it doesn't feel like it's doing much, but it's offering some support. Keep the chest lifted. Maybe you start to walk the hands back. It's kind of up to you where you take this. We're coming into a low lunge or a dragon is what we call it in yin. Hips can sink forward. Just make sure you're still leaving space left in the pose for you to explore. You can look down the bridge of the nose and just focus on one spot. Start to listen to your breath. Make sure that's still slow and steady. Back toes can be tucked, or you can rest the top of the foot on the mat, whichever one you find gives you more comfort. And if you're not using blocks underneath the hands, you can bring the hands up to the front thigh, and that's a great way to keep the chest lifted. If you're using the blocks, you can find a height that works for you, but we're trying to keep the chest a little bit higher. So it's not about bringing the chest down low. It's a different opening in the hips with the chest lifted. One more inhale in through the nose. As slow as you can, back out through the nose. If you're using blocks, set the blocks off to the side. Bring the hands down to the mat, tuck the back toes, lift the back knee. So now you're in a more active lunge, which could feel really nice for that left hip. And then from here, you're going to bring the hands forward a little bit. Right foot goes over to the left. You're coming into single pigeon. So set the shin down. See if you can stretch that left leg back behind you. Hips rest right on top of the bolster, the blankets, whatever you're using. You could also put a block underneath that right hip if it's lifted. So coming down onto the forearms, if that feels like it's an easy place for you to be, and the head can come down to a block, hands, wherever you are, but it's not your deepest hip opening. Actually, Indian, I think we call this sleeping swan instead of single pigeon. So the names change. And sometimes it gives us a different feeling in the shape, depending how connected we are to those changes. And in this shape, you want to feel like the back of the hips are level. So if you were able to look at yourself from up above, one hip shouldn't look higher than the other. If you're using props underneath the hips, that helps you level them off. If you're not, it's something to think about. Well, start to walk yourself back up onto the hands if the chest came down low. You can set the block or anything in front of you off to the side. Tuck the back toes, lift the back knee, step back to downward facing dog. So right foot goes back. As soon as you get there, you can bring the knees down to the mat. It's just a transition. Then if you liked using the blocks, take the blocks up to the tallest height underneath the hands. You want them out ahead of the shoulders. Give yourself some space so you can widen the blocks, and then step the left foot forward, coming back into that low lunge. Have the bolster up against the right thigh. You can start to walk the blocks back, but you already did this on the first side. So you know how the intensity builds over time, and you know where we're headed after this shape, back to sleeping swan. So you want to make sure that you explore the shape in a way where you have uh, plenty of space to go a little bit deeper and not have to back out. You don't want that intensity to build to a place where you can't be in the shape anymore or struggling to stay in it. You're keeping the gaze down the bridge of the nose. So if the eyelids are half open, you can let them be heavy. If you're comfortable closing the eyes, you can do that too. You want to feel like you're maximizing the space in the forehead and the space between the eyebrows. And you'll start to push the hips back a little bit. If you're using blocks, set those off to the side. Bring the hands down to the mat. Tuck the back toes, lift the back knee. You might need to walk the hands forward a little bit. This front foot's going to go over to the right. So you can heel toe it over to the right, get the shin down to the ground, shift the hips back until you feel like they're even. Top of the right foot's resting down, big toe pointing back. And then you can start to fold forward over this left leg. And I didn't say it on the first side, but whenever this shape doesn't feel good in that left knee, you want to come onto your back and do thread the needle. That's the alternative. It's the same hip opening. You're just putting less weight on that left knee. And it's a great way to protect your knees if you're having anything you're working around there. Blocks could go underneath the head, chest, hands, arms. Try not to rock way over to the left hip. Make sure you're even between each hip. Now walk ourselves back up onto the hands. If you went lower, set the blocks off to the side. As you press down into the hands, tuck the back toes, lift the hips, get that left foot back behind you for downward facing dog. Maybe pedal out the feet here, bending one knee at a time. It's actually a nice counter for sleeping swan. Then when you're ready, knees will come back down to the mat. So you're back to hands and knees. You can set the bolster off to the side. Come to seated with the legs out in front of you. So as you come to seated, sitting up tall, we'll just fold forward over the legs. So you could start with the knees bent so the heels would be on the mat, the toes could be up. And then you can lay the chest on the thighs. So you want to make sure the chest is completely touching the thighs. You can clasp opposite elbows, let the head and the neck go. And this is a nice place to start with your caterpillar or your seated forward fold. If you feel like this is enough, you can stay here. You could play with straightening the legs a little bit more, but don't lose the connection between the chest and the thighs. So it might not be much of an adjustment at all. That's fine. And this is a nice way to open up your back safely. Especially if it's tender. So if you're working around something in the back, probably a good idea to stay here, especially if it's the lower back. Everyone else, you do have the option of extending the legs all the way out in front of you, and you'll lose the connection between the chest and the thighs when that happens. So you're welcome to try that out. It'll get a little bit deeper into the backside of the legs. Palms can face up. You can let the head and the neck go. And if this is uncomfortable or you're feeling any discomfort in the back, bring the knees back in toward the chest, clasp opposite elbows, stay there. And we'll start to come back up to seated wherever you are and bring the legs over to one side. Make your way to hands and knees, coming toward the center of the mat. And then let's take some rounds of cat-cow. So stack the shoulders over the wrists, hips over the knees. On the inhale, reach the heart forward, lift the tail. On the exhale, rounding of the spine, belly hugs in to support the lower back. Then you can go back and forth a few times. Doesn't need to be a big movement, but you do want to explore some range of motion in the back. And finish the round that you're on. Bring the big toes together, knees slightly apart. Then if you want to, you're coming into child's pose. If you want to use a bolster, a block in front of you, that could be nice. So if you take the bolster, lift it up, bring a block underneath the end of the bolster only goes just between the knees, just a little bit. So you have plenty of room to come down onto the bolster, resting the head. And the block can move wherever you want it. So you want to feel like you can let the upper body be totally heavy on the props if you're using them. You can definitely take a traditional child's pose with no props and the forehead down on the mat. If you're using props, you're probably going to want to turn the head to one side. If you have the head turned to one side in your child's pose, lift it, turn it the other way, see how that feels. You can always go back if you need to. You'll start to lift the head back up, come up to hands and knees. Let's set the props off to the side, set the bolster off to the side, set the block off to the side if you're using that. Bring the feet to one side, come back to seated on your mat. You'll want your hips to be more in the center of the length of the mat. Make sure you have a block, maybe 2 blocks next to the hips. Come on down onto your back. Soles of the feet are down on the mat. You want to walk them in so the heels are underneath the knees. And then press into the feet, lift the hips up, slide the block underneath the hips. So just start with one block on the lowest height. You can lift the chest up a little bit. So that way you feel lifting and spreading happening there. You also get the shoulder blades underneath you. And then as you look up, close the eyes and start to settle into this shape. So you're coming into your first real back bend. And if you don't have a block, maybe use some folded towels or a pillow, something to elevate the hips. If you like to take the block up to the medium height, you can press into the feet, lift the hips up, set the block on or set the hips down onto the block. This is if you're fairly comfortable with back bends. It is a lot higher than where you were. We are still trying to keep this practice gentle. So you can always come back down to that first height. You can stay right here with the block on the medium height. If you have two blocks, you could stack them one on top of the other on the lowest height. So you'd press into the feet, lower the first block underneath you on the lowest height. See if you can lift the hips up high enough to get the other block right on top of that one. Then the hips go a little bit higher, chest lifts and spreads. You might need to lift it a little bit to get the shoulder blades underneath you. And this is a deeper stretch for the front side of the body. It should still feel somewhat gentle. We've worked our way up to this. You want there to be an ease in every pose we do in yin. Chin is away from the chest. If you're all the way up on the two blocks stacked, press into the feet, lift the hips up, slide one block off to the side, take the lower block to the medium height. So you're going back down the way we came in. If you're already on the medium height, stay there. If you're on the lowest height, stay there. And if you're on the medium height with the block, press into the feet, lift the hips up, bring the block to the lowest height, set the hips down. So we should all be on the lowest height with the block at this point. Feeling the difference between the two heights. One more option here. If you want to extend the legs out in front of you, you're welcome to do that. Only if it doesn't bother the lower back. You want to feel like the lower back stays long. Pointing the tail between the feet helps with that. Maybe you lift and spread the chest, but it could be a nice way to get into the tops of the hips, top of the pelvis area. Legs can be relaxed. This is the area we've already spent some time in, top of the pelvis, with the dragons, the low lunges, and the sleeping swan shapes. If you have the legs out in front of you, bring the feet back to the mat one at a time. Press into the feet, lift the hips up. Everyone set the block off to the side if you're using it, and just let the hips rest back down onto the mat. It's that last one where you really feel the difference, even though it didn't seem that high up on the way up. Okay, hug the right knee in toward the chest. Keep that left foot on the mat. And switch sides. Right foot comes down to the mat, left knee comes into the chest. So this is our counter from the back bend. Left foot comes down to the mat. Press into both feet, lift and scoot the hips over to the right just a little bit, and then bring the knees over to the left. So you're coming into a spinal twist. If your lower back feels tender, take a block, bolster, blanket, pillow, whatever you have, put something between the knees that keeps that space there in the lower back. If you're fine without it, you can skip it. Right arm reaches outside the right shoulder, and the gaze falls over the right arm. If the neck's okay with it, you could stay looking up. You can even look to the left too, if that feels better on your neck. And you're not forcing yourself into the twist once you've got yourself set up. So knees are going to the left, chest is opening up to the right, and then see where you can let go. So you're not driving the twist, but you're just being in it. And maybe over the few minutes that we're here, you'll start to feel a release in the back. Long, smooth, healing breaths. You'll start to find your way back to center. Use the feet, get them back to the mat, find center on your back. And you'll bring the knees in toward the chest. Hang on to the knees and start to move the knees around in a slow circle. Go the other way. And we'll set the feet back down to the mat. This time we lift and scoot the hips over to the left, knees come over to the right, left arm reaches out to the side, right hand can rest on the body. Create some space between the knees with some sort of prop if you did it on the first side, or if the lower back is asking for it. You find yourself diving into the twist, see where you can back off and just let yourself fall into it instead. And find your way back to center, taking your time, soles of the feet to the mat, and bring the knees in toward the chest. Same thing we did on the first side. You want to find those slow circles, keeping the knees and the feet together. Go the other way. Let's set the feet back down onto the mat. Roll over to your right side and use the hands to bring yourself up to seated. So once you come up to seated, if you have two blocks and a bolster, you'll use them. If you don't, find a chair, a sofa, bed that's nearby, or you can even use a wall and you can do legs at the wall. If you have blocks and a bolster and you want to use them, tallest height. Take the bolster, bring that up on top of the blocks. And you'll turn to one side. So the side of you is facing either the wall, the chair, wall, or sofa, whatever you're using. Bring the feet up on top of the bolster. If you're using a wall, the legs just go straight up and the back sides of the legs are completely supported by the wall. If you're using the bolster, you want those thighs to be vertical. Bring the hips in toward the bolster and the blocks. Set the head down, arms down by the sides. And this is our Shavasana. So finding some elevation of the legs. Feet are not touching the mat if you're using the blocks and the bolster. Arms down by the sides. Take one more deep inhale in through the nose. Exhale back out through the mouth. Let go of your breath control. Just allow the body to go back to breathing on its own. Coming into an experience of complete relaxation. You'll start to wiggle the fingers and the toes. Bring the knees in toward the chest. And roll over to one side, maybe the right side if it's available. Be careful of the props if you're using them. You'll just find a comfortable seat. So cross-legged seat if that works for you. Sitting up tall with the eyes closed, just noticing how you feel, where your practice is taking you today. What shifted and changed. Bring the hands together in front of you. Slight bow of the head. Keep that lift of the chest. Take a moment to yourself, honor and acknowledge your heart and spirit, as well as everyone around you. Bring the head back up, blink open the eyes. Namaste. Thanks for joining Yin today. I'll see you next time. Stay well.